Okay, so I'm going to start again just because of the timing, and I hope to save a little bit of time so that we can have some final discussion. I should start by telling you that I'm kind of stealing the agenda here today, because the agenda today was to talk about Tilly's book, and what I'm going to talk about now has nothing to do with Tilly's book. It is about my current research project, which many people in the room are a part of. You can see up at the top, I'm the principal investigator of the Inclusive Early Childhood Service System project. Co-investigators include Elaine Frankel and Magdalena Janus, who are in the room. Kathryn Church, she is in the room. Good. She's also been very influential in the project and is a collaborator. As you heard at the beginning when we did introductions, there's many people in the room who are employees of the project. So that's how we filled all the seats. We paid people to be here. So I'm going to introduce the project and then in addition, here's why I'm stealing the agenda. The first two presenters are both people who I have solicited to become part of the project. So this is like all of you witnessing my sales pitch to them to get them to engage with the project. So I took up the opportunity to talk about it while they're here, because they have both been invited to be part of the next phase of this research work. So this is bringing together people in this room. And so this project is about experiences that families have interacting with institutional services when they have a child who is thought of as disabled. So it's got a long title, but I didn't want to drop any of the words in the title. They all were important to me. That's why the title is so long. So inclusion is a complicated word, as Kristen's described, and some of the students who are in the undergraduate course who are here, I briefly had a conversation with them. The undergraduate disability studies course that I'm teaching is a hybrid course, so I put ideas out there, and I'm not always sure if people are engaging with them or not. That's the tricky, and I'm very new at online teaching. So I've put a few ideas out there in terms of inclusion, particularly related to work that Kristen and I have done together, including having one of our articles on the reading list, that include the idea that if inclusion is not just a placement, it's about who you're interacting with and having the ability to make choices about who you interact with, and who gets to decide who you're interacting with. So a lot of inclusion work has focused on placement, where children get service. And often in history, it's been defined as being with your typically developing peers. And there's lots of problems with that. One of them is, who are these mythical, typical people? Because all of us are different, right? And it depends on what we're measuring, who becomes the typical ones. But in addition to that, there are lots of reasons why people want to be with other people who they are like, for lots of reasons. And the notion of super diversity, I think, captures that, because each of us have many, many identities and find other people to connect with for lots of reasons. We can't always decide that just by looking at somebody, by even knowing who their family are. So how do we get to a place that's called inclusion? And so I like to think that rather than thinking about inclusive programs, we have to think about inclusive lives. And so that's what I mean by the term inclusive here. Only an individual can decide if they feel included, and I actually think none of us feel included all of the time or excluded all of the time. This is a dynamic relational process. So the project that has been developed in collaboration with a number of people in this room, in addition to 4 municipal governments, including the City of Toronto, the City of Hamilton, Wellington County, and the District of Timiskaming in Northern Ontario, which is about a 6.5-hour drive straight north from Toronto, and Constance Lake First Nation, which is several hours past that. I'm looking at Nicole, it's her home community. It's far away from this center. In this project, we've asked families from these 5 communities about their experience, and it's a longitudinal study, so we've asked them over a number of years. Most of the families we started when the children were age 2, intentionally, because around the age of 2, we expect children to walk and talk, and if they, in a normative sense, and if they don't, we start to refer them to services. Other children are born with disabilities, and we know in advance that they're unlikely to walk and talk or other things, but around 2, we start to get enough children that it's easy for as researchers to sample. We also purposely wanted to talk to people before they went to school, because there's a lot of research about school, and there's not nearly as much research about what it looks like before you go to school to be a person with a disability. The concept of disability is largely defined by the institutions we interact with. So this study, influenced by Kathryn Church, became an institutional ethnography. We were interested in how that interaction with the institution was actually starting to construct disability, and also the daily practice of interacting with institutions. And Kristen talked about how important it is to speak with families. We felt the same way. Well, I come from a School of Childhood Studies. I think it is important to talk to young children, but as Tilly said, we can't ask children to be responsible for the service system. We certainly aren't going to ask 2-year-olds to be responsible for the service system. So I think there's some good questions to ask of young children, but I think the questions in this study are appropriately asked of parents. So we have 67 families in these 5 communities who we've been talking to over a few years. We're just starting our 3rd year of data collection, and so most of the families the children have started to age into schools, although we have a number of parents who we've reached out to this year with the expectation we are going to hear about their experiences with school, and their children are not going to school because the schools told them that they couldn't help children with their needs. So that's a surprising thing for us. Well, I don't know if it's surprising. It's a concerning thing for us to be hearing. Some of those children then went to private schools or to special schools, but we have heard a number of stories about people going into their home school in the community and being told we don't have services for children who are like yours. So what I have behind you, I'm not going to talk about all 67 families. We have an enormous amount of information about each of these families. But using this approach called institutional ethnography, we've started to map the experience that families have. So what you have behind me on this very complicated slide that I'm going to describe to you is one of our maps. And this map is from a particular parent, one of the parents in the study. She happens to live in Hamilton. And so we selected this particular example because this mother told us that she had the best situation. So I want to point out that there are families, not all families are angry and feeling upset about their services, but I think even embedded in this story, there's a lot of the construction of childhoods and the construction of disability that were talked about in the previous presentations. So I'm just going to describe what's on this map to you a little bit, and then I'm going to tell you about the questions we're asking from the research point of view. So this along the bottom is a timeline, and each of these circles is a birthday for the child. So you can get a little bit of a sense of the open circles, the donuts are like our annual time points. And so around the first birthday, the mother said, my child doesn't have great language skills. And the child actually went to, she took her child. Is that okay to step behind you? We're dancing. So just before age 2, the child went to childcare. This is childcare number 1. And in that childcare center, they said to the mom, your child's got a lot of behavior problems and is very difficult. And so they would call her quite a lot and ask her a lot of questions about her child, and she'd say, well, I don't know, I'm trying to figure it out. So here, all of these lines are referral lines. And the mother over here, every line that's attached to the mother are places the mother found herself. So that's a lot of work that this mother did to find a soccer program that would take her child, to find childcare where her child could go. And this first child care center, eventually, the situation became so untenable that she removed her child from the child care. It was a mutual removal. The child care center didn't think she should be there either. But they did have what's called a resource teacher. Some of you have had training in resource consultation. There was a resource teacher there, and the resource teacher said, yeah, this child has a behavior problem. The mother said, I can see that, but I think there's a language problem. So she contacted the agency that runs preschool speech and language services in her community. And she did a self-referral to their what's called early words. So the child started going to early words. And that seemed like it might help. And so she got into this circle of services, which is speech and language services, which is, I'm looking at Michelle in the room. She's doing her master's research paper on specifically speech and language services, because they're typically what everybody gets referred to in the early years. Is this starting point? You talked about entry points, Tilly. In terms of institutional interaction, speech and language services seem to be an entry point for almost all of the children in our study. It seems to be central in terms of where people get sent, probably because of our normative ideas about language. And Kristen's done some research on what it looks like for deaf children to be referred to speech and language services. But I think that it's important for us to recognize all children getting referred there are getting particular messages about childhood and what is normal. So they go there, and then this problem happened. She got kicked out of the child care center, so she doesn't know what to do. She does go to church, and the church is very helpful, and that's one of the places where she's always felt included. And her child goes to Sunday school. They're very open at this child, and they don't care about the diagnosis. Over here, we see childcare number 3, number 4, and number 5. These are all places where she tried to get someone else to take her child. And she was told, sorry, behavior problem. Nobody wants people with behavior problems. And this is to do with that social relationship, right? If you don't seem like you're going to be easy to relate to, then people don't want you. And we start that very, very young with children. So we have a whole set of services in here that relate to the city of Hamilton. They have a child care registry to try and help parents get child care. But up here is the live-in nanny. So in terms of institutional interaction, she couldn't find anybody to care for her child. She ended up becoming involved with the Foreign Trained Professionals program and learning all about how to support somebody to immigrate to Canada to work in her home, because that's who she could find, who was willing to work with her child. So that's a big thing for somebody to do, right? Some of you may have immigrated to Canada yourselves and know what that experience is like. Maybe you don't, but it's not a simple thing to just say, oh, I can't find a childcare, so I will help a person immigrate to this country to care for my child. That nanny happened to have worked with a child who had autism in Hong Kong before coming to Canada. And they said she was very patient and found this child not to be at all a behavior problem. I don't know who she worked with before. There was some connection to that in the story. But this group here also then referred her to an occupational therapist, and these telephones mean a professional referral happened, formal professional referral. So this speech therapist sent them to an occupational therapist, and the occupational therapist said, this is more than a language problem. We need to get you sent to a developmental pediatrician. So they made a referral to a developmental pediatrician who worked at McMaster Children's Hospital. In McMaster Children's Hospital, this circle here is a big, big circle with a lot of boxes and lines and stuff happening in it. You don't need to know everything about that. That's just characterizing. It's purposely complex, this picture, so you can get a sense of how messy this story is. This is where she said, wow, things have finally kicked into place. She got an autism diagnosis. That autism diagnosis changed their world. Now, some of us might say, well, that's a very normative thing to happen, but from an institutional standpoint, it was a complete turning point. All of these childcare centers that said he was a behavior problem over here, with that autism diagnosis, might have looked at him in a different way. They might have treated him in a different way, but pre-diagnosis, he was a problem. Post-diagnosis, he's a different kind of problem. But a different kind of problem that comes with money and services and some other notions of what that means. So here, why she said this was so good and I'm going to sort of summarize the picture I'm describing to you in a second with these quotes from the mother. Why she said this was so good is this group of people who were at the autism clinic at McMaster said, you need to be in childcare. That's tricky, right? She got kicked out of childcare. She couldn't get into childcare. She got this live-in nanny. And they said, what you really need is childcare. And why? Because all of these services they were delivering, they know from research are better, more effective if they're delivered in a childcare, in a more natural setting, where there's social relationships taking place. So they helped her to find childcare number 6 who actually believe in this approach. And so it all came back together here with childcare number 6. All of these professionals working with the family, they signed consent agreements so they could share information, and she feels that she's got the best thing going. What she has is all of these professionals talking openly with each other, having conversations with each other, including the staff in the child care center, the supervisor, and she says it's so warm, they care about her child, and her child is flourishing in that environment. But from an institutional pathway, it's a little bit ironic that she ended up at this place where what she needs is childcare, when what she had was childcare. So I think it's worth considering what happens in between and how our institutions operate, how we think of children, how we think of disability, and how we construct them in these environments. So this particular person we have not interviewed for the 3rd time. What we have over here, though, is a final box which just represents a meeting, and that's an intake meeting for school. Magdalena's nodding. Magdalena and Elaine both have lots of expertise in this area of transition to school. She finally got all of this going over several years, and now she's going to go to school, and the whole system's going to change. How those services are generated, who she qualifies for, what the child qualifies for, how that gets generated is all going to change again. And what we know from research by other colleagues and team members is that typically the services, there's far fewer services, and when you do get services, the intensity of those services is less. And the interaction with the families most certainly is less, because in our school system, in our education system, we don't see the family as the client. The family are just a means to an end. The family are good for fundraising, and we need to send them report cards, but they're not actually in need of services from schools, nor do schools offer services to families for the most part. Whereas in early childhood, we do tend to think of families as being part of the work that we do. So you can see this institutional shift over time. So I'm just going to read a few of these. Some of them are quotes and some key ideas that we pull from this particular case. So she calls this the best case scenario. When she gets to this circle, she says, it is so incredibly well coordinated. And the really big thing is, because I signed the consent for email sharing of information, we have a nice email list between myself, the speech and language pathologist, the OT, the developmental pediatrician, the clinical resource person, and the child care. We can coordinate visits, we can coordinate assessments, we can share information. I get reminders and vice versa that there is an appointment today. And in the meantime, I can go to work. That's the key. I can go to work. And the reality is that many of the families cannot go to work. She describes this as coordination, and our province is implementing a new coordination strategy. I think one of the things to recognize about this is that she still is doing the coordination herself. It's not that there's a professional coming in and taking that from or doing it for her, but that everybody's open to communication, and that's what coordination looks like. Diagnosis here is important. That's at this point because this is where diagnosis happened, and the map changed with diagnosis. Many families describe getting a diagnosis as a turning point in their institutional interactions. In this map, we see a dramatic reorientation of services post-diagnosis. Many children will not have a diagnosis at this age, and we know that there are big differences. You also need to know that this map was in Hamilton, which is a big city. Not as big as Toronto, but it's a pretty big city. What this looks like in other communities in this province is not the same. So we do have families in Northern Ontario, Indigenous families living on reserve who get a diagnosis and no services follow that until school. So the geopolitical context really matters. Childcare and community programs are important. All of this got lined up when there was a childcare center involved in this. So often we think about services as being clinical, but it was really critical for this family to have a community community space. So we had a whole heap of services set up for him, but what he needed was a daycare environment for it to happen. Because he was kicked out of every daycare, he was at home with a nanny, which was great, but he needs to be in a daycare environment or some type of childcare environment. The last point I'm going to make here is that overall, one of the questions that we ask is, how does this system work? And we know that this system works because the mother's doing all this work. Embedded in this system is a huge amount of work from the family. So the mother says, I am currently the only one who regularly works with him, meaning doing therapy, which means that if I ever didn't do it, it wouldn't happen. So I often express that frustration with the Autism Spectrum Disorder Clinic because for the last 2 years, it has felt that all of the weight has been on me. And so I think when we talk about families, it's important to recognize that families both are being put in this position of doing the work, but also they are the context within which children experience their childhoods. And so we need to be careful about what we're asking families to do and to be. We don't want families to be clinical environments. We want families to be places where children learn, because all children learn in their families. But what is it that we're asking of families? And I think that's an important question to ask.